The real estate industry is the world's single largest contributor to climate change. At Fifth Wall, we're on a mission to help the industry eradicate its carbon emissions and build to zero. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining. Where are you zooming in from today?
Thanks for having me. I'm in San Francisco currently.
Nice. Well, I'd love to chat with you about kind of specifically all the interesting things you've done in your career around sustainability and some of the lessons that can be learned for the real estate industry from that. But can you start maybe by just giving people your background and how you got interested in sustainability?
Sure. So I am a material scientist by training, undergrad in material science at UPenn, came out here to California to do a PhD in material science at Berkeley. And I found myself in the years 2005 to 2009, sort of in the right place at the right time. At Berkeley, the professors who I was working for and working with became the Department of Energy's clean energy mafia, if you will. They all sort of got absorbed into the Obama administration. And all of a sudden, I had a lot of credibility because of the folks I was associated with. And at the same time, didn't really see myself staying in academia, wanted to go into the business world, and found there was just a lot of interesting things going on in the world of clean tech, a lot of new investors coming into the space, the ecosystem developing at Berkeley and Stanford, and was a part of a program to look at waste heat. So all of the wasted energy that comes out of buildings and power plants and cars and factories and things like that. And a funny anecdote about how things got started there. I actually called up my best friend from New York, growing up, a guy named Ashish, who was in real estate private equity. And he had been involved with some transactions with a couple huge office buildings in Midtown Manhattan. I said, Ashish, there's a gigawatt of waste energy being basically expelled into the sewer system in New York under Midtown. I need to get into these buildings and talk to the building managers and check it out. And so my first foray into really looking at clean tech was in the Helmsley building in New York. And down in the basement of the Helmsley building with the building manager, sort of a wake-up call where the building manager was just like, look, my job is to keep the lights on and to keep the HVAC running, right? Very rational, sort of spreadsheet-driven, low-risk decision-making process. And I think that sort of informed my last, 13 years of being in sustainability and trying to push clean energy products into the market. Is that as much as we might hear about how important sustainability is, the industries that can make huge impact and that need to change a lot are industries that are inherently not risk takers, right? They're industries that are inherently concerned with other things. Like real estate, right? And so at Alphabet Energy, we ended up selling primarily into the automotive and oil and gas industries, speaking of conservative industries, and it was always an uphill battle. And I think, really in clean tech, we all sort of learned that at the end of the day, it boils down to cost. And so a lot of clean tech companies had this classic chasm problem, right? Where you get to a point where you need to scale up in order to bring your costs down. But in order to do that, you need an enormous amount of capital. And so you're sort of teetering on the chasm of death there, and not many companies made it. And so Alphabet Energy did really well getting product to market eventually, sort of had a bit of the chasm problem. But at the same time, and I think overall, the real challenge at Alphabet, I'll just close that thought with, is that we were at the behest of the oil price, right? So commodities prices really don't go well with a venture-backed model. You want, when you're venture backing a company, you want to be able to enter the market at a really high price point. You want to be able to have control over your own destiny and not be at the behest of whatever the commodity that you're trying to compete with is trading at. And so after oil was at a really, really low price for a while, we had to close Alphabet stores. We ended up selling the company. But what that led to, sort of an understanding that materials have the potential to have enormous impact in tons of different areas, whether they're buildings or heavy industry, but also things that sort of we as consumers really like fashion, footwear, things of that nature. And there are lots of really interesting innovations happening in the fashion and luxury industries, where there's an enormous amount of waste that's created every year. And so I was drawn to materials innovations in that area because those are industries where emotion is really a part of the purchasing decision. You're closer to the consumer.
It's consumer driven, right?
It's consumer driven, exactly. And so when you have something that's consumer driven, it's not quite as spreadsheet driven, right? You can appeal more towards some of these themes that are so powerful in the economy right now around health and wellness and alternative protein, veganism, anti-plastics, right? There are these incredible tailwinds that I think are truly secular. We're seeing that big brands, big companies are making real supply chain changes that are going to be very long-term and very durable towards these trends. And so thought that, by looking at materials innovations in those industries, those would work really well with a venture-backed model where, you had the ability to be more of a price maker and to enter the market with something that people would pay for initially while you came down your cost curve to address the mass market, which is what we're doing now at MycoWorks, which is the company I've been CEO of for about 3.5 years now.
And I want to make obviously that transition, but just to double click on Alphabet's business, I guess when you were looking at the real estate industry, when you looked at all of the energy consumption, right? Because the real estate industry is, we both know, like one of the most consumptive industries with respect to energy, which is kind of a counterintuitive point to a lot of people. I guess how much of that energy is wasted, and how would you define wasted, right? Or wasting that energy? Like, how do you think about it? How should people be thinking about that when they look at a building and they're trying to understand how efficient it is?
Yeah, that's a great question. Buildings do comprise an enormous amount of total energy consumption, and that's primarily through heating, ventilation, air conditioning, HVAC. And lighting, of course, plays a big role. Computers, servers, things like that we have in a modern office building play a big role. But heating and cooling are the biggest areas of energy consumption. And I believe buildings comprise about, real estate, if you will, comprises about 1/3 of all energy consumption. The other third being heavy industry, factories, the other third being transportation. So it's really an enormous amount of energy that's being consumed, which when you think about it makes sense because it's where we are, right? It's where we need to acclimatize our lives, right? So we need energy for that. So, heating and cooling is very wasteful. About 2/3 of all the energy that's used for heating and cooling and electricity is wasted. There are some interesting exceptions. Actually, New York City, where the first power plant was, built by Thomas Edison on the Lower East Side a very, very long time ago. New York City has one of the most efficient building HVAC systems in the world because of the district heating system. So from day one, district heating was designed into the city so that the waste heat from the power plant gets recycled as steam that goes right up into all the radiators in New York.
It's a closed loop. It's kind of circular in the sense that exhaust,
right,
which would otherwise just be spilled into some useless, right, diffusion of energy, is now actually heating people's homes.
Exactly. And so those district heating systems, I think there are about 12 of them in the United States. 12 municipalities that have district heating are extremely efficient. So New York City actually operates, I think, close to 90% energy efficiency overall, whereas most power plants and most energy systems in general are closer to 30%. So there is an enormous opportunity in thinking about how, that of course being an extreme case, but generally speaking, there's an enormous opportunity in thinking about how we design buildings to be more energy efficient. And one of the this is very dated now. This was probably 10 or 15 years ago, but one of my PhD advisors, Arun Majumdar, was very much involved with measuring building efficiency. And LEED certification can be very misleading. It's, you have to look at, is the LEED certification being done, based on the design of the building or the actual operation of the building? And what I found really striking about that huge gap between what buildings were LEED certified for versus what they were actually performing at, there's a huge gap in the understanding of how buildings actually perform once you design and build them. And a big piece of that is materials, right? So insulation, if you're using certain building materials, how does that affect heat transfer throughout the building? So, it's remarkable how simple things like ventilation, which, have become even more important over the past year because of COVID, ventilation now appearing to be one of the more important factors in reducing COVID transmission. I think that's something that's going to be applied to common cold and flu transmission in general. And I actually think there's a huge upcoming HVAC revolution that can occur, right? I think now that we understand not only so much about energy, but also about how viruses are transmitted indoors, we're going to see that ventilation is going to be redesigned in a lot of modern architecture. Or at least it should be. So I think there are really interesting opportunities there.
And how would you redesign it? Is that what does that mean? Like, because when I conceptualize ventilation, it's hard for me to intuit how you would redesign it. Like, what does that mean to redesign ventilation within a building?
That's a great question. I don't know what the answer to that is. I can tell you that from my experience in dealing with energy efficiency in the automotive industry, there's a lot of work around zonal cooling. So the idea that instead of all the AC coming from, the dashboard, right, being blown directly on your face, can you more efficiently cool the body by having a lower flow of air, maybe through the seat or, above you, below you, things like that, so that you get cooler, your body temperature comes down faster, but with lower overall energy consumption. That's very important in cars when you're looking at extending the range of electric vehicles. I think that's one of the big opportunities that people are going to be looking at now as they aim to enhance ventilation and also filtration inside buildings.
And I also want to, ask you about, you made this kind of transition with the insights it sounds like derived from Alphabet Energy, that materials can have this profound effect on the performance, the sustainability performance of anything, from a fashion good to a building. And you made a point earlier that in some ways the connection is more direct in a consumer space like fashion, right? Because the feedback loop might be faster, and there's also an emotional charge and intimacy to a product that a building just doesn't have, right? And the transaction of how someone leases space is so complicated and arduous and obtuse that it's like hard to draw correlations between a more energy efficient building and more demand for that building. But how did you think about that transition, and walk me through that inspiration?
Yeah, so, at Alphabet Energy, what I saw firsthand is that sustainability can get you in the door. It can be something that people talk about. It can be a driving factor for, say, a first meeting with a customer. But it's not going to be the deciding factor in a purchase decision, right? At the end of the day, things have to perform. Things have to do what they were intended to do. And fashion materials is no exception. And so, I saw what was going on in this field of biomaterials in general. So really fascinating field where materials are now being synthesized using biology. So think of, the laboratory is the loom now. You can come up with materials that microorganisms can make, that they can secrete, or that in our case, we can control a fungus, a mushroom, to grow sheets of mycelium, their roots, into a really tough, durable material that is like leather, that we can turn into this leather material that we call reishi.
Wow.
And so, this is a huge breakthrough in material science, because we've developed this platform that allows us to engineer the organism as it grows as a sheet, something you can't do with an animal hide, of course, and you can't even do with plastic. And so, while those tailwinds that I mentioned earlier, the anti-plastic movement, alternative protein, veganism, all these things, while they sort of are the leading edge of any sales pitch, well, they get our foot in the door, and well, these are things that are on consumers' minds. Consumers, when they're presented with an option between something that might be an eco brand or something that might be really high performance, like a sneaker, right? They're typically going to pick the high performance product. Consumers don't want to sacrifice performance for sustainability, quality for sustainability. And so, like what we saw in clean tech, I think what I was seeing in fashion and biomaterials is that a lot of eco brands were popping up, but I didn't think these eco brands were going to have staying power, because eco brands tend to be a bit more fatty, right? There's a lot of greenwashing going on, and it might look good, in an ad campaign. It might be good, a cocktail party conversation, but at the end of the day, are they going to really be durable businesses? And I think that what materials can do, the power that they have, is that they are the basis for any products that we make. And so if you can deliver a material that has extremely high quality and extremely high performance, that also potentially even has new features, things that you couldn't do previously, it allows new products to be made, and it allows consumers to connect with those products in new ways and in very powerful ways. So
what's an example of that?
Well, an example is reishi, this material we make, right? Because, when I met the founders, Phil and Sophia, really fascinating story. They actually founded the company as artists. Phil was an artist sculpting with mycelium, growing mycelium into different forms for 25 years. And he had invented all of these different materials with mycelium, foams, bricks that he actually initially experimented with as building materials. So, just as a quick tangent, he was even working with NASA on a program where instead of bringing building materials to Mars, they would just bring a little vial of mushroom spores, and they would grow the mycelium on Mars and turn that into building materials, right? Because this mycelium, it has incredible properties. It's super tough, super lightweight, fire retardant. It's really an incredible material. And so when I met Phil and saw his material, I said, hey, this is really differentiated. This is very different from what other people in this field are doing. The quality is so high that I think we can really make an impact in the market by, instead of competing as a sustainability brand, as an eco brand, by actually just competing as another form of natural material. And so that's what we're doing at MycoWorks. We are another option for natural leathers, right? The earth has given us cows and sheep and snakes and crocodiles, all these things that we turn into leather. And now we have harnessed mycelium in a process that we call fine mycelium, that has incredible durability, incredible strength, allows us to make all kinds of, or our partners, I should say, to make all kinds of amazing products with the material, handbags, shoes, things like that. And our partnerships there are really awesome, and they're going to be products in market in the coming months with our material in it, made with reishi.
And it sounds like the kind of inherent tension you were describing before between one's sustainability sensibilities and their ethics and the performance of a product, that tension is not there, meaning there's no inherent trade-off. And to some extent, it sounds like the synthetic product is actually better than the less sustainable product in leather. Is that the case for reishi?
Yeah. And we don't like the word synthetic because it's still a natural material, and synthetic sort of implies plastic, right? But that's just semantics. Yes, your point is well taken. And I think that it really is that is the crux of being able to have true impact. If a brand, and that's what our brand partners are really excited about. They're excited about the idea of transforming their supply chains, because currently leather is very, very wasteful. There's an enormous amount of waste through the entire value chain. A lot of leather is scrapped. And that's because you're dealing with a raw material that's completely uncontrolled. And an example I like to give is just how opaque and uncontrolled this industry is. You can walk into even a mediocre restaurant today, and they'll tell you what farm your cut of meat came from, right? You can buy $1,000 pair of leather boots, and you have no idea what farm that leather came from.
Why?
No
because
idea.
Because the supply chain is just so opaque and there's so many intermediaries before it ultimately gets delivered to the brand and in turn to the customer.
That's right. There's just no traceability whatsoever. And what that means to a brand is that they have very little control, right? You know, if there was a drought in India that year, if there were more mosquitoes in Brazil that year, that's going to change the quality of the hides. And in turn, that's going to change the quality of the finished product. So what brands are really interested in doing, you know, the definition of luxury, and, you know, that has now extended all the way to, you know, the big sneaker brands, for instance, right? The Nikes and Adidas of the world. You know, they're looking for complete control over everything in their supply chain. So the ability to have input into the raw material to say, look, we want you to grow MycoWorks. We want you to grow the raw material to exactly this specification, same way every time. That can lead to huge changes in the way that they source, use, deliver the material, recycle it at end of life, which is ultimately, you know, the responsibility of the brand to build products that can be recycled at end of life, and educate the consumers on how to do that. And it starts with a really good raw material. And so our brand partners are really excited, not just about the lower carbon footprint or some of these, you know, sort of near term sustainability performance metrics, really about how this can create huge efficiencies in their supply chain that make it a better overall material to buy and to use.
And probably more predictable, right? There's
Exactly.
a durability and a resilience to that supply chain when you're not as subject to, you know, variances in temperature or crops or, you know, livestock in different geographies.
Totally.
And,
Yeah.
and I guess what I'm curious about is kind of two components of that seem very relevant for the real estate industry. One is how consumers are communicating their preferences, both, it sounds like, their sustainability sensibilities and what they care about, their ethics. They're communicating that to brands in their purchase decisions, and how that's ultimately flowing back into the demand for raw materials, because to me, there's a big lesson there in what we can do in the real estate industry. And the second is actually in supply chain tracing, right? Which in the real estate industry is equally opaque. Like, the real estate industry makes buildings, and every building is totally bespoke or nearly bespoke. It's a totally customized project, and you have all these subcontractors. And so all of their materials, it's nearly impossible to trace, but it's estimated that for a given building, about 30 times its operational carbon footprint is its embodied carbon, the amount of carbon it took to actually get the materials and erect that building out of those materials. So I guess when you think about what you've learned from the fashion industry, what are some of the lessons and insights for sustainability forward real estate owners that are trying to learn from what other industries have done well to apply to their industry?
Yeah, I think the first big lesson is that consumers are truly making decisions with their wallets right now based on sustainability. They really are. And if they weren't, we wouldn't have hundreds and hundreds of brands breathing down our neck for more material, right? We are seeing just crazy demand for what we're doing. And to answer your question directly, I think what it's about is measurement. It's about metrics that we can now use as an industry to compare different options in materials or other things in our supply chain. So what the fashion industry has done really well, and what the leaders in the fashion industry have done, such as the Kering Group, you know, one of the big luxury holding companies, is they actually have an environmental profit and loss that they have audited every year that becomes a part of their executive performance and what they're measuring as a company. You have things like the Higg Index, which measures the overall sustainability of a raw material. And so I think that when you have the ability to truly measure sustainability, it allows consumers, like with anything else that they would buy, you know, go online and draw a comparison between a few products that they want to buy, like we all do when we want to make a big purchase decision. Now there are tools available in these measurements around sustainability that let brands do that with materials like ours. And that's growing for consumers with the actual finished product. And you see that in the marketing that a lot of fashion brands are doing. They're talking about numbers. They're talking about real impact that their decisions and their sustainability efforts are having, are making.
And it sounds like
so I think that
there's almost like a quantitative rigor to it, meaning
that's right.
So much of what I think is challenging in any industry is that a lot of what sustainability unfortunately morphs into is highly impressionistic. So like, for example,
very subjective.
In the real estate industry, we talk to real estate owners and we'll say, well, what are you doing, to reduce the carbon footprint of your assets? And they will say things like, well, we have gardens on our roofs where, the tenants can grow tomatoes. And I'm like, well, that's cute. That's nice, but that really has no impact. Like a handful of tomatoes you grow on your roof has nothing to do with the amount of concrete you just poured into the earth. So like,
that's right.
It's distracting and it's not empirical and it's not technocratic. And it sounds like what your product or companies like Kering are doing is they're making it more traceable in a numeric way that in turn is passed to consumers and changing the kinds of questions they're asking of brands, right? There's less receptivity to kind of the casual greenwashing that you do see in a lot of industries.
Yes, there's a lot of greenwashing, and we expect transparency today. We live in an era where you can find out anything about anything very quickly online. So if there isn't transparency about what's going into the thing that you're buying, the thing that you're devoting time to, whatever it might be, you're going to be skeptical of it. Brands are saying, look, we want to know the quantifiability behind sustainability in your material. Brands are rejecting general greenwashing claims. You have to quantify it for them. And so I think that you could do the same thing for a building, of course, right? And this tests my knowledge, the limit of my knowledge of how this works in buildings. But the life cycle analysis of a building is certainly not a far-fetched thing. You know how much carbon a cubic meter of steel or concrete is going to emit.
The interesting thing is, and I imagine it's relevant for transportation, is that you do know it at the materials level. But one of the big challenges in real estate, which I imagine is true in fashion, although it requires a little more imagination to figure it out. Yeah. Well, Matt, this has been just so interesting, just getting your thoughts on just hearing your kind of career arc and like the inspiration from real estate and energy waste now into kind of high fashion and high performance materials. But also just like some of the lessons I think the real estate industry can learn from that. So thank you so much for just sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me and great chatting with you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Matt.